I let my son take care of me when no one else would. Saturday was supposed to be just another ordinary, uneventful day. I stood at the stove, listening to the soft sizzle of eggs in the pan while the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Despite the familiar sounds of the refrigerator humming and the occasional creak of the wooden floor, the house felt hollow, like it was holding its breath. My husband had left for work again, rushing out with his usual hurried excuse. "Sorry, I can't make it today." His words lingered in the air like an unwelcome ghost. At this point, I wasn't even upset anymore. I'd grown numb to his absences, to the spaces in our life he should have been filling but never did. But something about that morning felt off. Maybe it was the weight of the silence pressing against my chest, or the way the walls seemed to inch closer, threatening to swallow me whole. As I stared down at the eggs in the pan, I felt a sudden desperate need to escape the monotony of it all. I turned to my son, who was sitting at the kitchen table, glued to his phone. "How about we hit the beach today?" I asked, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice. He looked up, his brown eyes, so eerily like his father's, meeting mine with mild curiosity. "The beach," he repeated, his tone flat but vaguely interested. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Your dad's busy, and your sister's at a friend's place. We could use some sun, right?" He shrugged, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Sure. Why not?" The drive to the beach felt longer than I remembered. The sky stretched out above us, a stunning shade of blue. The kind of day that almost begged you to leave your worries behind and just exist. My son sat quietly in the passenger seat, earbuds in, staring out the window. Every now and then I glanced over at him, marveling at how much he'd grown. He wasn't a little boy anymore, but sometimes, in the way his hair flopped into his eyes or the rhythm of his fingers tapping along to a song only he could hear, I caught glimpses of the child he used to be. When we finally got to the beach, it was packed. Families sprawled out on brightly colored towels. Kids dashed in and out of the waves, their laughter cutting through the salty air. We found a spot near some rocks, away from the noisy crowd, and set up our small camp. The sun blazed overhead, the heat almost suffocating. I stretched out on a towel, letting its warmth seep into my skin while the sound of the waves rolled over me like a soothing melody. I closed my eyes, willing myself to let go of the tension that clung to me like a second skin. "Mom, can you help me with the umbrella?" my son called out, his voice breaking through my trance. I opened my eyes and sat up, squinting against the sunlight. He was wrestling with the umbrella, the wind threatening to send it flying. I got up to help him, and our hands brushed as we adjusted the pole. "Thanks," he said, flashing a quick smile. I sat back down, watching him settle beside me. There was something grounding about his presence, something that made the quiet feel less oppressive. After a moment, I hesitated before asking, "Do you ever feel like life is just passing you by?" He turned to look at me, his brow furrowing. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But what can you do? You just keep going, right?" His words hit me harder than I expected. It was a simple truth I didn't want to face but couldn't ignore. I nodded, my gaze drifting back to the endless ocean. The day wore on, the sun sinking lower in the sky. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us felt different, comfortable even. For the first time in years, I felt a tiny flicker of peace. As we packed up to leave, a sudden gust of wind knocked the umbrella over again. My son laughed as he chased after it, his lanky frame silhouetted against the setting sun. I watched him, a strange mix of pride and longing swelling in my chest. On the drive home, the golden light of the sunset bathed the car's interior. The radio hummed softly in the background. I glanced over at him, his face calm and content. "Thanks for coming with me today," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He looked at me and smiled. "Yeah, Mom. It was nice." That moment hung in the air between us, delicate and fleeting, but it felt like something new, something I didn't want to let go of. For the first time in years, we weren't just two people living under the same roof. We were something more, something I couldn't quite name, but I wanted to hold on to it for as long as I could. The next morning started the same as any other. I stood in the quiet kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring sugar into my coffee. But as I thought about the beach, about that fragile connection we'd found, I realized that for the first time in forever, I wasn't dreading the day ahead. That morning, my son wandered into the kitchen later than usual, his hair sticking out in all directions and an oversized hoodie swallowing him whole. "Morning," I greeted him with a small smile, sliding a plate of toast his way. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he slumped into a chair. Something between us felt different, lighter somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was just me hoping that yesterday's trip to the beach had started to chip away at the wall we'd built between us. By the afternoon, we decided to head into town. I suggested we pick up some groceries and maybe grab some ice cream, something we used to do all the time when he was younger. At first, he seemed indifferent, giving me the typical teenage shrug. But as we strolled through the bustling streets, weaving between tourists and locals, his usual aloofness started to fade. We ended up at a small outdoor market, the kind where the air is thick with the scent of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and the occasional whiff of flowers from nearby stands. I stopped at a vendor selling strawberries, turning a basket over in my hands to inspect the fruit. "Anything catch your eye?" I asked, glancing over at him. He shrugged again, but this time there was the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe those," he said, nodding toward a pastry stand. I bought a few pastries and handed him one as we headed back to the car. "Don't eat it all in one bite," I teased, nudging him lightly. The sunlight filtered through the trees as we walked, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I realized how much I'd miss days like this. Simple, easy, full of little moments where we felt like more than just two people sharing a house. That evening, the house was unusually quiet. My husband was working late again, and my daughter was still out with her friends. My son and I ended up in the living room, the TV murmuring softly in the background. I'd found an old photo album earlier while cleaning and was flipping through it, smiling at the memories it held. "Look at this," I said, holding up a picture of him as a toddler with chocolate cake smeared all over his face. He laughed, leaning closer to get a better look. "I remember that day," he said, his voice warm with nostalgia. We spent the next hour or so poring over the photos, laughing at the ridiculous moments and poking fun at each other's past haircuts and outfits. Somewhere in the middle of it, I felt a sharp pang of something. Regret? Longing? Maybe both. I missed the days when life felt simpler, when I wasn't just going through the motions. At one point, I looked up and realized how close we were sitting, our shoulders nearly touching. His warmth was tangible, and for a moment, it felt like the distance between us had truly disappeared. He must have felt it too because he turned to me, his expression softer than I'd seen in years. "Thanks for today," he said quietly. Before I could respond, he leaned over and kissed my cheek. A quick, almost casual gesture. But it caught me completely off guard. My breath hitched and I struggled to find my voice. "Of course," I finally managed, barely above a whisper. The moment hung there between us, fragile and heavy all at once. His eyes carried a quiet intensity one hadn't noticed before, and it made my heart skip in a way I didn't quite understand. The air felt charged, almost suffocating, so I stood abruptly, needing to break the tension. "I should get started on dinner," I said, escaping to the kitchen. Chopping vegetables felt like a safe distraction. The rhythmic sound of the knife hitting the cutting board grounded me, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying that scene in the living room. It was just a kiss on the cheek, I told myself. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing to overanalyze. But the unsettled feeling refused to leave. By the time I served dinner, the house had fallen back into its usual rhythm. My husband came home late as expected, his tie loosened and his face marked with exhaustion. He kissed me on the forehead absent-mindedly before collapsing onto the couch. "How was your day?" I asked, hoping for something more than the usual monotone response. "Busy," he muttered, already absorbed in his phone. I turned back to the kitchen, that familiar weight settling over me again. But when I glanced at my son, still sitting at the table, he gave me a small smile. In that moment, it felt like everything might actually be okay. The days that followed felt strange, like they existed in some sort of suspended limbo. I went about my usual routines, cooking, cleaning, half listening when my husband droned on about work. But something was different. I caught myself watching my son more often, noticing how much he'd grown, how his expression seemed to carry layers I hadn't seen before. One afternoon, as I stood at the sink washing dishes, he wandered into the kitchen. "Need a hand?" he asked, leaning casually against the counter. I laughed softly, glancing over my shoulder. "Since when do you volunteer for chores?" He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "Just thought I'd offer." I handed him a dish towel, and we worked side by side in silence. It wasn't an ordinary kind of silence, though. It felt charged, like something unspoken was hovering just out of reach. Later that night, as I sat alone in the quiet house, it felt emptier than ever. My husband was off on yet another business trip, and my daughter had decided to spend the night at a friend's house. That left just me and my son, the silence between us growing heavier as the hours dragged on. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence exactly. Just thick, like the weight of unspoken thoughts was pressing down on both of us. "Do you want to watch something?" he asked, finally breaking the quiet. "Sure," I said, grateful for the distraction. We settled on the couch, scrolling through options until he landed on some action movie full of car chases and explosions. It wasn't something I'd normally pick, but I didn't care. The glow of the TV bathed the room in soft light, casting faint shadows across the walls. I hadn't realized how close we were sitting until our arms brushed. It was a light, fleeting touch, but I didn't move. And neither did he. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind refused to cooperate. My thoughts were tangled, a mess of feelings I didn't want to name. I couldn't tell you the plot or even the characters' names. The images on the screen blurred into the background as the weight of the silence between us filled the room. About halfway through, he shifted beside me, turning slightly so he was facing me. "Mom," he said, his voice low. I glanced at him, startled by the intensity in his eyes. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my tone as light as I could manage. He hesitated, his gaze searching mine. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something? Like there's this emptiness you just can't fill?" His words hit me like a punch to the chest, knocking the breath out of me. I felt a tightness in my throat as I tried to form a response. Finally I nodded, my voice barely more than a whisper. "All the time," I admitted, the truth of it hanging heavy between us. Saying it out loud made it feel raw, exposed, as if admitting it gave it power. For a moment we just sat there, locked in a strange, wordless exchange. His eyes searched mine and I couldn't look away. The air between us felt thicker, heavier with every passing second. Then, as if compelled by something neither of us fully understood, he reached out and took my hand. It was such a simple gesture, small and unassuming, but it carried a surge of emotion that left me breathless. "I just want you to be happy," he said, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. His words knocked the wind out of me. Tears stung my eyes, but I blinked them away, unwilling to let him see how deeply his words had cut, or how much they'd meant. I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile that felt thin, almost brittle. "I want that for you too," I murmured, my voice trembling under the weight of everything I couldn't say. The intensity of the moment overwhelmed me, like I was standing too close to a fire. I couldn't stay there. It was too much, too close. My chest felt tight, and my heart raced in a way I couldn't explain. "I should check on the laundry," I blurted, standing up abruptly. My movements were jerky, desperate to escape the heaviness of the moment. Without waiting for a response, I hurried to the laundry room, the pounding of my heart echoing in my ears. What was happening? Why did everything feel so complicated, so tangled all of a sudden? By the time I came back, he was still on the couch, his face unreadable. I sat down at the far end, deliberately putting space between us. Neither of us said much after that, but the silence was charged, thick with everything we hadn't said. The next day, I suggested we go grocery shopping together. It felt like the perfect distraction, a mundane task to ground me in the familiar. As we walked through the aisles, I tried to focus on the list in my hand, on the simple act of grabbing milk and bread and checking items off. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. At one point I reached for a jar of sauce on a high shelf, stretching on my tiptoes. Before I could grab it, he stepped beside me, reaching up with ease. His fingers brushed mine as he handed it over, and I felt it again, that strange jolt like electricity sparking just beneath my skin. "Thanks," I said quickly, my voice a little too high, too fast. He nodded, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to the shelves. By the time we got home I felt drained, not physically but emotionally. I needed space, needed time to process the knot of feelings tightening inside me. That evening, as he disappeared upstairs, I stayed in the kitchen, mindlessly unpacking groceries. My hands moved on autopilot, putting things away while my thoughts churned. The normal rhythm of life felt off-kilter, like I'd stepped into someone else's story. Later I found myself on the back porch, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped low. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, beautiful enough to take my breath away. But I couldn't appreciate it. The weight of everything, the quiet moments, the unspoken words, the feelings I didn't understand, pressed down on me heavy and unrelenting. My mind was too crowded, too tangled up with thoughts I didn't want to name, emotions I wasn't ready to face. The gentle creak of the screen door pulled me from my spiraling. I turned and saw him standing there, framed in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just walked over and stood beside me. His presence was steady and quiet, but it carried an undercurrent that left me both comforted and unsettled. I felt the weight of him next to me, the way his nearness made everything more real, more charged. "Mom," he murmured, his voice so soft I almost thought I'd imagined it. I turned to look at him, and for the first time in a long while I really looked at him. He wasn't the little boy I'd been holding on to in my mind. The way he stood, the thoughtful way his brows pulled together, he'd grown into someone I barely recognized. The realization hit me hard, like the ground giving way beneath my feet. He wasn't a child anymore. He had thoughts and feelings I didn't understand, a depth I hadn't noticed before. He was becoming his own person, and that shift left me momentarily breathless. "Yeah?" I asked, my voice hesitant, almost as though I was afraid of his answer. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine, then finally spoke, his words deliberate and measured. I want you to know I'm here for you. Always. No matter what happens, I've got your back." The sincerity in his voice hit me like a wave, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. His words, so simple on the surface, carried the weight of everything we weren't saying. They settled over me like a heavy blanket, equal parts comforting and suffocating. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay grounded. "I know," I said quietly. My voice didn't shake, but it was thick with emotion. "And I'm here for you too. Always." We stood there side by side, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. The colors, soft oranges and pinks melting into the horizon, were stunning, but I could hardly appreciate them. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it wasn't easy either. It was the kind of silence that carried too much meaning, that spoke of things neither of us were ready to name. I allowed myself, just for a moment, to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. We were teetering on a line, a fragile boundary between the safety of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The realization left me feeling unmoored. The weekend came quickly, bringing with it the looming family dinner my husband had insisted on hosting. A few of his colleagues and their families were coming over, and though I wasn't in the mood to entertain, I agreed. It was easier to say yes than to argue. He was excited, and I didn't have the energy to dampen that. The house, of course, was a disaster. Clutter everywhere, laundry in heaps, and a thin layer of dust coating surfaces I hadn't had time to touch in weeks. "Mom, do we really have to do this?" my son asked, leaning against the counter as I stood surveying the chaos. His tone was heavy with teenage irritation. "Yes," I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Your dad asked, and it's been a while since we've hosted. It'll be fine." He rolled his eyes but didn't argue. "What do you need me to do?" The question caught me off guard. He didn't usually offer to help without a little prodding. Gratitude swelled in my chest, unexpected and sharp. I handed him a list of tasks, and without a word we got to work. We started in the living room, vacuuming the carpet and wiping down the coffee table. It wasn't glamorous, but the simple rhythm of cleaning felt grounding. Slowly, the mess began to recede. Next came the kitchen. He scrubbed the counters while I swept the floor. We moved around each other in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. By the time we tackled the dining room, the sun was high, and I could feel the sticky heat of sweat gathering at the back of my neck. Why does it always feel like this place gets messy the second we clean it? I muttered, picking up a stray pile of papers from the dining table. Probably because no one ever puts anything back where it belongs, he replied, holding up a random sock he'd fished out from behind the couch. A smirk tugged at his lips. I couldn't help but laugh, shaking my head. As we worked, something about the process felt cathartic. Not just the cleaning itself, but the ease of his company. It was a reminder, however fleeting, that even in the midst of everything, there were still these small moments of connection. Moments that felt normal even if nothing else did. By the time the house was ready, the afternoon sun had begun to dip. I was exhausted, not just from the physical work, but from the emotional weight of the past few days. As I stood in the kitchen looking out at the neatly set dining table, I felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Fair point. Maybe we should get better at putting things away, I admitted with a wry smile, feeling a flicker of lightness amidst the chaos. The afternoon slipped by in a whirlwind of cleaning, and slowly, the house began to shed its layer of disorder. The clutter that had felt insurmountable that morning disappeared little by little, each task chipping away at the overwhelming mess. "We're almost done," I said, glancing at the clock. "But we're cutting it close. They'll be here in less than an hour. Do you want me to set the table?" he asked, already reaching for the plates and glasses. "Please," I said, the gratitude in my voice probably more than the moment called for. As he arranged the table with a kind of quiet precision, I quickly wiped down the last of the kitchen cabinets. By the time we were finished, the house looked almost presentable, but we were both drenched in sweat, our clothes clinging to us in the most uncomfortable way. Catching a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror, I couldn't help but laugh. My hair was a tangled mess, and there was dust streaked across my clothes. "There's no time for a proper shower," I muttered to myself, glancing at the time. Without thinking, I grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the bathroom. "Come on," I said, a touch of mischief slipping into my voice. "We'll rinse off quickly, clothes and all. 2 birds, 1 stone." "Are you serious?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, his expression caught between amusement and disbelief. "Yes, I'm serious. Now hurry," I said, urgency creeping into my tone as I pulled him into the bathroom and shut the door behind us. I turned on the shower, watching the water cascade down in a steady stream. The small bathroom quickly filled with steam, the air growing warm and thick. Without a second thought, I stepped under the spray, fully dressed, gasping as the cold water hit me first. A shiver ran through me before it began to warm up, easing the discomfort of the day. "Come on," I urged, motioning for him to join me. Laughter bubbled in my voice as I spoke. For a moment he stood frozen, as if trying to decide whether or not to indulge this absurdity. Then with a soft chuckle, he stepped under the water. His clothes were instantly drenched, clinging to his frame as the water soaked through. We both burst into laughter at the ridiculousness of it all. The water splashed around us, and we tried half-heartedly to wring out our sleeves, shaking off the grime of the day. "This is definitely not how I pictured my Saturday," he said, shaking his head, droplets flying from his wet hair. "Me neither," I admitted, laughing harder. "But at least we're clean now." The spontaneity of the moment was like a breath of fresh air, cutting through the heaviness that had been weighing me down. The warm water washed away more than just sweat and dust. It seemed to ease the tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. When we finally stepped out of the shower, our laughter still echoing in the small space, I handed him a towel. "Dry off quickly," I said, my tone light but firm. "We need to change before the guests arrive." He nodded, a grin lingering on his face as he grabbed the towel. He paused for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read before he disappeared into the hallway. I stayed in the bathroom a moment longer, staring at my reflection in the fogged-up mirror. There was something about the warmth I felt in my chest that I couldn't quite define. It was foreign but not unwelcome. The evening passed in a blur. Guests filled the house, their laughter and chatter creating a lively hum that buzzed in the background of my thoughts. I went through the motions, pouring drinks, making small talk, smiling when required, but my mind kept wandering back to earlier in the day. To the water, the laughter, and the unexpected sense of connection. When the last guest left, and the house finally grew quiet, I felt the weight of the evening settle over me. My husband had gone to bed hours ago, leaving me to clean up alone. I didn't mind. The silence felt oddly soothing. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, my mind replayed that fleeting moment under the showerhead. It had been effortless, stripped of all the roles I was supposed to play. Just me unguarded. And in that moment I'd felt alive. The following weekend arrived, carrying a strange heaviness I couldn't shake. My husband was gone again, off to another meeting, and my daughter was away on a school trip. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I sat in the living room folding laundry absently, trying to keep my hands busy. My son walked in, dressed in a faded t-shirt and jeans, his hair still damp from his morning shower. "You look tired," he said softly, his tone filled with quiet concern. "I am," I admitted, my shoulders sagging. "It's been a long week." "Let me help," he offered, his voice gentle but insistent. And in that moment the weight in my chest seemed to lift just a little. He stepped closer and placed a firm but gentle hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward the couch. "Lie down," he said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "You need to relax. I'll give you a quick massage." I blinked at him, caught off guard by the unexpected offer. His words carried a genuine concern that I hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. Hesitating for just a moment, I let out a small laugh. "Okay, but don't hurt me," I teased lightly, hoping to dispel the lingering tension in the air. A faint smile touched his lips, just a flicker, but enough to soften the moment. Without another word, I stretched out on the couch, resting my cheek against a throw pillow, its fabric cool against my skin. His hands found my shoulders with a warmth that felt both grounding and soothing. The moment his fingers pressed into my tense muscles, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, as though the tightness in my body had been holding back a flood of emotions. "You're really good at this," I murmured, my voice tinged with surprise. "Where'd you learn?" He chuckled softly, the sound low and warm like an echo of comfort. "Nowhere really. I guess it's just natural," he said modestly. His hands moved with a steady rhythm, each motion deliberate, as if he instinctively knew where the tension lived. As his fingers worked out the tight knots along my shoulder blades, I gasped slightly, the unexpected pressure unlocking something deeper than just physical pain. "Your hands," I said, laughing softly despite myself. "They're like rocks. How are they so strong?" He paused briefly, as if considering the question, then laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound. "I guess I've been working out more than you realized." "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up," I said, another small laugh escaping me. "But maybe don't overdo it." He smirked faintly, shaking his head as his hands continued their work. The massage lasted only a few more minutes, but by the time his hands stilled, I felt lighter, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted. Sitting up slowly, I brushed my hair away from my face and met his gaze. There was something in his eyes, a quiet intensity, a depth that felt both comforting and disarming. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The sincerity in my tone surprised even me. I didn't realize how much I needed that. "You're welcome," he replied softly, the warmth in his expression making the moment feel more significant than it should have. For a brief instant the air between us felt charged, as if something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. But before I could give that feeling a name, the doorbell rang, shattering the quiet intimacy like a glass dropped on tile. The neighbor stood on the porch, a package in hand, explaining it had been delivered to their house by mistake. I thanked them, closing the door with a forced smile, but the interruption had already done its work. The rest of the day unfolded in an easy rhythm. We cooked dinner together, sharing stories and stealing moments of quiet laughter. Later we sat on the couch, half watching a comedy show that had us both laughing until our sides ached. It was the kind of day I hadn't realized I'd been longing for, simple, light, and uncomplicated. That night, as I lay in bed with the house cloaked in silence, I replayed the moments of the past few weeks in my mind. There had been something building between us. Unspoken words and fragile connections that felt both comforting and precarious. It was a balance I wasn't sure could last, a line we were both careful not to cross. But in that moment, lying there in the quiet darkness, it didn't feel like something I needed to solve or analyze. It was enough to just let it be. As sleep began to claim me, a single thought lingered at the edge of my mind. Sometimes the things left unsaid carry more weight than the words we manage to speak.